Hi, everyone. This is Charles Hoskinson broadcasting live from warm, sunny Colorado. As promised, this is the chosen video to talk a little bit about Intersect and how things are going to start transitioning over from the input output repos to Intersect. So hold on to your hats. It's going to be a long video. It's going to be a whiteboard video, and I'm going to share my screen here in just a moment. But let me bring up some links for you just so that people can follow along and take a look at some things. Okay, so first things first, let's talk a little bit about Intersect. So if you've been following, wow, the discussions we've had about a Cardano members-based organization, what we did is we named the MBO Intersect. If the community doesn't like that name, they can change it. But basically, this is the aggregation hub for a lot of different things. And in the whiteboard video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the kinds of things that Intersect as an MBO does and how it's governed. Now, the most important thing that's relevant to the heart and soul of Cardano are the GitHub repositories. So if you take a look at these repos, you can see there are enormous amount of people that work on them on a regular basis. Cardano Node, Daedalus, Plutus, Adrestia, all these things. The Cardano CLI, Ledger is so many repos. I think we have 636 repositories. A subset of these are directly connected to the heart and soul of Cardano. And this is kind of the staging ground for almost 15, 16 companies to work together to basically build Cardano, the protocol. So it's a very decentralized group, but we've been taking the lead in organizing that repository. So what's going to happen is it's going to transition over to Intersect throughout the summer, and a whole governance structure is going to be put around that. And so the purpose of this video is to talk a little bit about how this transition is going to work and some of the things that are going to happen. So easier to draw, it slows me down a little bit, and also it allows us to have no ambiguity, which is very important. Okay, so right now we have the IO repos, and they're going to move over to the Intersect repos. Okay. And what's going to happen is that input output, we have this concept of tribes, and each tribe is connected to a different concept, like smart contracts, for example, core technology. So smart contracts covers things like Plutus and Marlow, extended UTXO, these types of things. Core technology covers the core node, network, consensus. We have tribes like Identity. We have tribes like sidechains and so forth. So there's collections of them, and they do lots of stuff. So what's going to happen is if you take a look at the product function of Cardano, all these things come together to a Cardano product backlog. So it's the list of all the things that each of these individual tribes, which constitute hundreds of engineers across 15 companies, are working on in some capacity. So we've been calling that backlog continuity and GCD. So the kinds of things getting Cardano done, the kinds of things that are related to that roadmap of Shelley and Basho and Voltaire and Gauguin, and then continuity is just kind of the daily affairs: better, faster, cheaper, less memory consumption, improvements, API enhancements, all these types of things. That forms a backlog. And what's going to happen throughout the summer is that working groups are going to be established at Intersect, and those working groups basically take over the function of these tribes. So the leadership of these tribes on our end, they'll join the working groups. But then what'll happen is that the community can come in, and they can come from many different places. So NFTs and DEXs and Cardano DeFi, all the leadership of these things, and join those working groups. The current backlog that we have will be moved over to those working groups as a suggestion. And what'll occur is then those groups will decide what's in, what's out. And as the repos move over, meaning the code moves over, basically the group of engineers that work here plus the others will get credentialed here, and they'll start executing in 2024 the new backlog. Now, we have a PI system that goes quarterly. So we take a look at the backlog. We make decisions based on the backlog of what is achievable in a 3-month period. And then there's a pre and post. And so they make commitments and then they do a post mortem to see what actually got done. And there's usually a release cadence between 2 to 8 weeks, depending upon the nature of the project within that PI cycle to see how things are getting done. Okay, so once the code repos move over, there's a new notion of credentialing. And then these working groups basically allow the product function to become completely decentralized. So the backlog here basically becomes the backlog here. And then these working groups can decide things that go into the backlog in addition to or to replace the suggested backlog that gets thrown over the fence. Now, what'll happen is that you can divide this into 2 categories. Requires soft or hard fork. Does not require. So in both cases, SIPs will probably be written for significant, meaningful things, but some things will not require a fork, some things will require a fork. So the interplay of 1694 is that what 1694 can do, which is independent of Intersect. It's important not to conflate the two. This is kind of the government of Cardano. And then over here, Intersect is kind of an execution vehicle. So it gets stuff done. What the government does is it gives permission. So when things like protocol parameters, things like hard forks, all these types of things, it gives permission to do that. Hang on, I've just lost my, there we go. Wacom's can be a little touchy. Okay, it gives permission to do a hard fork. Also, it can authorize a SIP to be done. So there's going to be an interplay between the government of Cardano and the working groups here, and that can be done as a consolidated backlog, and a workflow has to be established. So as Intersect turns online, that's going to be something throughout the summer, fall, and first and second quarter of next year that starts getting memorialized of how that workflow is going to work. Regardless of how that workflow works, it fits very nicely onto a standard product backlog and PI system. So the engineers here basically have their groupings of work and they go and just pull it off the shelf, start doing it. And the various pieces of infrastructure that are relevant to the repositories will get done. And what's nice is you now have democratic consent. So you have a structure that basically gives permission to ratify a SIP and also to initiate a hard or soft fork. So this is a big thing, and there needs to be a lot of community participation with this thing. But the point of a members-based organization is it's very easy for community members to join. Over 200 have already joined Intersect. Many more will. And that organization is just kind of growing. And the point is it's owned and operated and run by the members. It's not-for-profit members space. And the goal of it is just to bring everybody together and have a place where they can actually talk about things. So it goes from the working groups to the SIPs to the actual implementations. And there's an authorizing function either for an aggregation of things or for individual things, depending upon the nature of those things. We already have a really good, hard-fought operating system for how to think about product and how to structure working groups. So step one is just to port that system over here as a starting point. And then what will have to happen is the system will have to be customized. to meet the needs of a members-based organization, Intersect, and this is an open process. Now, there is a question of how do we attract open source commitments, open source developers? So what we want to do is we want to have a situation where a lot of external contributors, once these Intersect repos are open, make contributions. And so one of the things that we're batting around right now, we're going to talk to partners like Emergo and the foundation, as well as the members of Intersect, is an idea of 4 courses that once you complete them, you get certificates that are posted on the Cardano blockchain, and something to cover Haskell, something to cover Agda, something to cover open source best practices. So these are specific practices to how software is made on the repo, and then a Mastering Cardano course. And the basic idea is you establish a technical baseline showing you know how to read and actually work on the code. You establish a baseline for how everybody works together in the system, and then you establish a baseline for how Cardano works under the hood. The network protocol, extended UTXO, how Plutus works, how Ouroboros works, all the APIs, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, these types of things get you up to speed as a core dev. So if they're designed correctly, you should be able to be in a position and demonstrate enough technical skill that you should deserve some credentials. So I like this because this is open and self-certifying. But it's merit-based. So you have a mechanism to prove you have the skills and knowledge, and anybody can do it. There's no gatekeeping function. And once it's done, you get a blockchain certificate, similar to how the Cardano Foundation is starting to do blockchain certificates for their educational materials. And then that translates to get credentials. You have to be very careful with these projects, and get credentials typically are a gatekeeping function, and whoever controls that is like the Arrakis of open source projects. He who controls the spice controls the universe. So he who controls credentials controls the universe. So if there's a collection of great content that we can build together that you can go through, then any person who wants to actually start working on Cardano has this. And then what you can do is look at the existing pool of developers and grandfather some in who've already been making major contributions to the system. So there would be an or, and they just have to decide what that or looks like. And who would decide that? The working groups and technical leadership of Intersect, and they'll ultimately have the final say who gets credentialed, who doesn't get credentialed. So what's nice here, though, is that you have a very good working structure where you have a consent engine where every single ADA holder now has a say on whether they think something is all right. And then you have an execution engine, which actually has a structure to allow anyone to become an open source participant and contribute to it. You have a way of creating a knowledge transfer so that there's people coming and going, but you always have content for that. And then you have an operating model that we figured out after the last 6 years, and that operating model is very hard fought, but it can reliably do releases in a 2 to 8 week period and structure a accountability structure where PI can be public, and every quarter you can kind of see what's going on, and you have one universal backlog. And this builds on a lot of the systems we've already, as a community, figured out together, like the SIP process, for example. It builds on that. So basically, we have a nice way of defining standards and change management. It builds on how we've handled a universal backlog, and it can learn from things like how Hydra has been a very successful open source program. And then we get to do some cool new things like blockchain-based certificates to get credentials. So you actually can drive some of the change of Cardano onto the blockchain itself. Now, there's a big open question of alternative clients and blueprints. Okay. So there are some people want to do Rust client. Saw on Twitter there's some people that want to do TypeScript, and that's great and fine. But the issue is, what is the canonical Cardano? Okay. So what is Cardano? Well, major innovation that's occurring right now with the SIP 1694 work, the Conway era that's being pushed out with SanchoNet, is that we actually wrote the specifications for these not in a prose like LaTeX, but actually in Agda. 6 years of research has gone into how to do this, and a lot of software has been written to build a workflow for this. The power of Agda is that it's implementation agnostic. What that means is that you have blueprints that you can do code extraction from, and you can use that to test and certify. And that's why there's this idea of an Agna class, because how to do that is a very specialized skill. It doesn't necessarily require a huge amount of time, and it doesn't necessarily require like a PhD, but you just kind of have to learn it. And we have a model that we've developed over 6 years that is IP of the Cardano ecosystem. It's something we've all learned together. We've open sourced it, and it's a unique thing we've brought to the table. This is the heart and soul of how you can safely move to a polyglot ecosystem. When you have alternative clients, you call that polyglot. Basically, it means many languages. So we want to have lots of alternative clients, but we want those clients to conform to standards and quality so that regardless of the client that you choose, you have reasonably the same level of a quality assurance that you have from the canonical Haskell client that we're currently using. What this also means is that you can ensure that certain properties, like the upgradability of these clients, so that hard fork combinator, for example, that gives very easy hard forks, is preserved throughout the entire system. So when people, the government of Cardano says upgrade, actually happens, as opposed to a developer over here on Rust or TypeScript or the Haskell side holding the network hostage and not adhering to the will of the Cardano government. So this is another big project to get all of Cardano covered with formal specifications. We have one level of spec. So this is kind of the Agda, and over here is kind of the LaTeX world. So overall, we have math blueprints that are implementation agnostic, but this is the particularly useful representation. And one of the things we're going to be doing throughout 2024 as part of the GCD agenda is getting end-to-end coverage of all of the prior work, so that there's one set of universal blueprints, and then creating an entire certification pipeline so that third-party clients can certify against it, and then all the users get a guarantee that the clients are interoperable with each other. Big house of work. There'll be a specialized working group at Intersect to facilitate this, and the formal methods tribe will work very closely with them and gradually work their way through. It's also an opportunity to simplify some of the blueprints of Cardano because, for example, there's been a lot of conversations about retiring some or all of the logic in Byron to massively simplify the design and reduce the complexity of the code, which would mean there's a much faster time to market for the Rust and TypeScript clients, and there shouldn't be any consequences to the users of Cardano because those are legacy concerns. So these are all some of the conversations. So there's a blueprint conversation, there's a certification conversation so that we can have many things. There's a lot of ongoing concerns there, and throughout the next months, things will start moving over, but we'll continue together working on that. There's a credentialing conversation that's happening right now. There's an education conversation that's occurring here, and then there's also a product management conversation of where should we go with Cardano. we have a continuity in GCD backlog that we put together as a suggestion. And as it moves over to the members based organization, then there's a debate and discussion amongst all the members, and that becomes a universal backlog. And that universal backlog can be ratified by the government of Cardano, which would be 1694 if ratified. So this is kind of a high level summary of a very, very complicated thing. Effectively, you're changing pilots in a fighter jet. It's moving very fast, and you're having to do some very complicated maneuvers. But we're moving to an incredibly decentralized working group. And what's so cool about Intersect is that it's made, operate, and run by you, the community. So what we can do is build buckets and institutions and fill them with some ideas and some capital to bootstrap and get it started. But ultimately, this is the organization the community uses to interface with things like the code, many different processes. And also, it's a thing that can become a custodian of knowledge, like things required to certify open source developers and other things. Now, this process can grow and evolve over time because we only have one client, the Haskell and Agda. But, if there's a Rust client, then you can add a Rust course. If you take that, then you get access to the Rust repos, assuming you know how to read the specs and the best practices and understand Cardano. And of course, these courses will change over time because every year the protocols evolve and get more advanced, and have different designs, and people have to stay up to date, just like doctors have to stay up to date, or other professionals like lawyers have to stay up to date. There's some notion of continuing education that occurs, and you either prove it by practice or prove it by certification, or both. So this is the current thinking that's in execution. There's a whole team here to transition the repos. There's a whole team on the other side to receive them. There's a huge backlog effort to get everything bow tied up. And there's already a governance and operating system for that backlog, and they're executing through a PI system on a quarterly basis. So this is all in flight. The fighter jet's in the air. And then over here is where the pilots change out. We're not going anywhere. No engineers are being pulled. No leadership is being pulled. We're just now adding a force multiplication. So it's going from one set of people to another set of people, and those things are basically growing up. The goal is to give the government of Cardano some options. Let me change this over here real quickly. Let's use a different color. How about purple? Not sure why that's. There we go. There we go. We want to give some options to the government. Okay, so buckets to fund. And then you have execution vehicles. Okay. And the basic idea is that you allow them to run for a transition period. And then what the government will do is look at these things and the accountability, the speed, the strategy, the resources required. And then they can vote on whether they want to continue that, or vote if they want to pivot that significantly. The other thing is this allows a tremendous amount of diversity at the client level. So you can have very different philosophies and people, but it preserves and protects the kinds of things that ensure that Cardano continues to have uptime. It's been up for over 2,100 plus days. So you need a SIP process, a proper change management system. You need a universal backlog that there's a consensus around. You need to understand that the people who are doing the work adhere to a certain level of quality, but you need that to be open and follow best practices of an open source project. And you need a pretty good operating model so that we can consistently continue to get upgrades. One of the things that would be quite tragic is during this transition, it goes to Intersect, bureaucracy creates a reality where things slow down considerably. The way things are structured right now is they've actually been speeding up quarter by quarter, and there's been more reliability that's been coming in quarter by quarter. And things are, even though we're doing more complicated things, there's being delivered in a reasonable time window. I don't want to lose that as an ecosystem. I think we need to continue moving quickly, but we do need to be moving with many voices because there are a lot of different opinions about things that should be priorities. And sometimes those are contradicting or divergent opinions. And it's very important to have working groups where those opinions can come together, have a discussion, and get all these things done. And then, of course, there needs to be a way of creating legitimacy for those opinions, not the trust me, bro, but a vote. And that's really the point of 1694. It's to have a deliberative body that's endowed with the power of the ADA holders through a series of checks and balances to review and understand, and in some cases, provide funding to buckets or to give consent to execution vehicles to do something. You run the system. Its idea is minimum viable governance. We call it MVG. And you run it for a little while, some period of time T. And that can be 6 months, that can be a year. And you look at the results and you ask some basic questions. Are we getting more decentralized? Are we still at the same level of quality, security, and reliability? Do we feel that more voices are being included in the conversation? Is Cardano as a platform getting more competitive? Are we gaining users? Are we gaining utility? Are we able to do new and more interesting things than we were doing before? These are some baseline questions that the legislative arm, the government of Cardano, is going to be asking. And then the execution vehicles have to make the case that the answer is yes through some sort of transparent and objective way. When you do a transition, you go from an internal conversation to an external conversation, and the community is absolutely ready for that external conversation. They want it, they demand it, they've been doing it themselves. It's just it's time for some unity so that they do it with one voice to get to a good universal backlog, and we measure everything. Now, if this government is unable to ask those questions, if the government is unable to produce good wisdom in that, then you have to go from MVG V1 to MVG V2. You have to add new checks and balances or systems inside the government. And that's what we imagine is going to happen is there's going to be this beautiful spiral where you start certain places and then you go to new places along the way. And every time you do it, you have more inclusion, more wisdom, more execution capability, more decision making capability, and better decisions. That's the point of good governance, that you can get things done, but you get wise, good things done on a regular basis. What's also super cool about this structure is that this structure can act as a primary, secondary concern. And what I mean by that is that you have Cardano as your top level project. But then you have these other projects like Hydra, for example, Open Prism, Plutus as the language, because that's different, Marlow. And just like Linux with the Hyperledger Foundation, and let me go and show you guys this because you might not be aware of it, and it's super cool. So if you go to hyperledger.org, take a look and see, wait a minute, Hyperledger is not just one thing. We all think Fabric. Well, actually, no, there's also Solang. I think that's on the Solana side. Noncreds, Bevel, Cacti, Calipercello, Firefly, Sawtooth, Indie, Fabric, Besu, Aries. You can look at the full landscape. Look at all this stuff. So what it is a governance structure for how to handle a lot of projects. Well, if you are a dApp developer and you're doing some dApp stuff, maybe you don't want to have to figure out, God, how do I manage an open source project? How do I handle all this stuff? You now have a model for your dApps to plug their repos, their code, and there's a broader collaborative structure and transitivity between these types of things. So the Intersect as a members-based organization is very much just like Hyperledger or the broader Linux Foundation in that it becomes kind of a master of managing these types of concerns. And so it gives the option to the dApp developer to have a place to go, partially or completely, to embed different programs within. Just super cool if you think about. And what's really nice about it is as Cardano's governance gets bigger, what's going to happen is that governance is, when we talk about funding buckets, that governance can actually provide consent to provide funding for some community projects which are deemed to be essential. And that is how you build a self-sustaining ecosystem that's self-reinforcing and truly decentralized. This is hard earned. It's come from over 6 years of talking to Apache, the Linux Foundation, talking to open source experts, watching what's happened in the cryptocurrency space, and trying to balance all of the different needs and powers. And it is a good initial starting point. There's minimum viable governance. Well, this is minimum viable structure, but you always must have the ability to design, just here, to control, here, and execute something. You always have to have an operating system that provides you that means. You also have to have an ability to take the people who are already doing great and exceptional work and put them into a structure where it doesn't slow them down dramatically. They just continue working on that. And what's really cool about this is that because of this structure, it's very easy to add many new companies or the existing companies to the repos and into the work system. Okay, so you have input output infrastructure. That's the company we've been setting up to roll the engineers into. It's a subsidiary of Input Output Group, the big company, and they just do the Cardano engineering. It's a highly specialized group. They've been doing it for years, and the bespoke leadership specifically to be the best contributor. But then you have others like the well-typed. That's, for example, Duncan Coots' company. He's been around since basically the near beginning. You have the Twigs of the world. You have the Galois and many, many, many others. And they have a common frame because now they can sit and they have one backlog, a nice diversified tribe style structure, and working groups to work through with the community. And so then eventually you can have many community groups like M Labs and the DC Spark and others come for the things that they care a lot about. So maybe they don't care too much about, for example, core technology, but care a lot about sidechains, for example. And what that does is it gives a place for them to decide what level of participation, from actual development to design and discussion of priorities to actually going down and managing things and building things and deploying things and verifying that those things are correct. But we keep our principles because we're working from implementation agnostic specifications. We have a rich certification process that allows a diversity of clients, and there's a government that removes any ambiguity of whether something is in the pool or out of the pool. So where and when that's required, they can ask for that, get it done. I think this will be, according to the EDI, the most decentralized and inclusive development process in our industry, because no one can ever be shut out just because somebody isn't liked or they're a competitor. You can always join the MBO with or without being part of the MBO. You can get credentials just by going through a self-certifying process. Everybody gets to see the same backlog and understand the reasons and justifications behind it. There's a clock ticking on a quarterly basis, the PI cycle and release cycles that these projects have. So the community gets to see continuous progress. And part of PI is the post-mortem. So the government of Cardano gets regular reports and gets to understand things. There's at any given time an unambiguous blueprint. So everybody understands what the reference is. There's a SIP process, which is inclusive. You don't have to be a member of Intersect to participate in it. In fact, it's managed by the Cardano Foundation, a different organization. But yet it is an integral component to these kinds of discussions. And it's very easy to add and subtract entities to become developers, which means when we talk about funding buckets, the Cardano treasury can be opened to add specialized firms to accelerate the roadmap where and when that makes sense, or to augment the existing firms to have more time materials developers to work on that common frame of reference. Now, is it perfect? No. There's a lot of overhead in trying to get all these pieces to work just right. Is there a lot of backlog of things that need to be done? Sure, but that's the point. 2023 is about getting that minimum viable government in place, and 2024 is about getting that execution vehicle and operating system completely polished and then refining the government to accommodate for that new beautiful thing. Every year it gets better, more open, more transparent, which means that it gets more decentralized. So you have an improvement on your decentralization index that is measurable. And that is a transparent thing to the entire community. So if you get knocked in the head and fall into a coma and come back 5 years later, you'll see enormous progress made, and everybody feels like they're actually part of something. It's all working together. This is probably the hardest thing I've ever tried to participate in my career, and no one has pulled this off in the cryptocurrency space. Not Bitcoin, not Ethereum, no one. It's very easy to do parts of these types of things, and there's legacy models to do these types of things. But to do all of this as one bucket, as I said, it's like changing pilots in a fighter jet while you're in the sky. It's not even changing tires on a car while it's driving. It's a very complicated thing. But what's truly extraordinary is it's actually happening, and it looks like it's happening on schedule, and every month things get stronger. There are 3 major events the community is putting on this year: Rare Evo, the CNFT Con down in Las Vegas, and then the foundation's putting on the annual summit in Dubai. One is in end of August, one is in end of September, and then one is in November. Each of these are checkpoints to have a lot of discussions about the specifics, and checkpoints also drive a lot of membership and get a lot of really good people into the organization. And as an MBO, eventually members pay fees to the MBO, and you have a free tier and a paid tier, and my hope is also a merit tier. By the way, that was one of the biggest areas of discontent with the Linux Foundation, was that they didn't want to have a merit-based membership tier. When we were in discussions of whether Cardano could be a part of that foundation as its own product or needed its own MBO. I really think if people are doing great work, they shouldn't also have to pay for the privilege to be on committees or other things like that. They earned that right, and they proved it to the community by the code they've written, the contributions they've made. So the MBO becomes self-sufficient, and the government of Cardano can choose to give it more resources, or fund alternative MBOs, or diversify funding to have multiple MBOs that do very specific things. For example, there could be MBOs that are, this one is very engineering oriented and roadmap oriented. There could be MBOs that are related to adoption and marketing, whose day job it is to go and get 10 million or 100 million people to come into Cardano. The people who run the government of Cardano, of which there will be thousands as it evolves, are the ones who are going to make that decision on a year-by-year basis, and they don't just make it, they put money behind it. They have access to the Cardano treasury, which is quite large, a lot of resources. But just because it's large doesn't mean it's a good idea to just throw it away. You have to have good institutions that have a proven track record, accountability, and good governance structures and audit structures in order to know that that's going to do the job. And that's why you set these things up as a try before you buy, as part of a handoff from the tripartite to the broader community. There's some initial funding that gets put into these things to get them running and some transitions. And then the government makes a final call of whether they think that that's useful or they want to move to something else. And that's okay, because they make the decision for everyone with the consent of everybody, as opposed to a small group of people deciding that they know better than everybody else. This is the point of decentralization and inclusion. You'd leave no person behind, and you work very hard to maximize freedom. By having implementation agnostic blueprints, at any given moment, any person can create a competing client and prove to the rest of the ecosystem that that competing client is just as good as the other ones, and it's safe to use. At any given time, anybody can get Git credentials They just have to prove that they have the knowledge required according to some objective standards. What are those standards? Well, Intersect can set that, not me. We can just give recommendations and put them over the fence. But ultimately, once they've been set, then everybody has to adhere to that standard and prove that they're deserving of it. This is how you don't develop a dev cult where these elite people decide as gatekeepers who's also elite and exclude anybody they disagree with. And thus you have forks in the code. It's an open system. So it's trust but verify. So anybody can build it, but they have to prove that it adheres to an open standard. Anybody can write an open standard, but this open standard has to be accepted. Anybody can contribute, but they have to prove before they get credentials that they're at a certain baseline of understanding of how the protocol works, how the structure of the open source project is, how to read the specifications, and for the relevant code base that they're adhering to. So Haskell is an example, but you could have dozens of these types of things. And those proofs are completely open. Now, here's the really cool thing. This actually doesn't require real life human identity. And talk about a revolution in decentralization. Let's say there's a rock star developer. You can associate with a DID, a decentralized identifier, a credential. But that DID could be McLovin, just an alias on the internet. You don't actually know who it is, but you can verify that credential. So this is super inclusive because it does not require a geography, a language, or a real life human identity. You can use aliases, but there's still trust because that alias is associated with a proof of merit. Work has been done. And that's what openness and inclusion is. You don't require people to compromise their privacy in order to be part of the conversation. This same concept of aliasing and credentials, because you can pay member fees when member fees eventually come to Intersect with ADA, well, doesn't that mean that you can serve on a working group as an alias and you don't actually have to be a real life human? That's pretty cool if you think about that. So basically, it's an open, completely inclusive system. People get to decide what they want to work on, how close they want to be to it, whether they want to have a real life human identity or an alias, and they prove to the system that they have merit. Once it's been proven in an objective, open way, then they can have a great voice in a roadmap that can then be ratified by others. Now, what if you disagree with all of this and you think all of this is nuts and you think it should go in a radically different way? Well, that's the point of something like SIP 1694, because you can have an alt vision and you can say, you know what? Vote for that. And if the government of Cardano says this alt vision is the way to go and all of this is nonsense, well, guess what? The alternate vision wins. This is all open source code in these repos. This protocol is completely open source. It's under the Apache 2 license. So what you can do is fork it, put it into the alternate vision, and obviously if the government's approving that, it's probably going to put money into that as well. So it can throw a bunch of ADA into that. And then this structure no longer has any legitimacy. And so probably the members will move over to the alternate structure. But I think there's a lot of reason behind this, and it's a good thing to try throughout all of 2024 as things move over and people scale up. And together as one community, we're going to learn a hell of a lot about it. And we now have the structures in place to use this in a responsible way. And then we can always be thinking about how do we do better? How do we add more? How do we move from minimum viable governance 1 to 2? How do we right size our expectations? And how do we, as one group, handle the product function? I often get asked, who's the product manager of Cardano? And it's not a person, it's us. Every single holder of ADA, every single person contributing to the project has something to say about the backlog, and they all matter. And so it's really important to build a structure where all of those comments can go into one place. And that's what gives you decentralization and inclusion and allows you to have the most open system. And that's what's going to define us. So it's been the work of my life, about 10 years to get to this point, and I'm proud of everything we've done. But this is the most significant event of the project's history, and the one that if we get right, it will make Cardano something that we measure its durability not in terms of years, but centuries. Something that's going to be around for a long time. And it's something that is impossible to stop because you have 3 million people who are engaged in the interest of thousands of commercial entities coming together, and they have a way of sorting all these things out without relying upon a particular jurisdiction or gatekeeper. And the system is self-reinforcing and resilient enough to remove barriers. So if there are problems in the system, it has a way of navigating around them, and there's nuclear options like a completely alternative vision that can be pivoted to in the event that the structures have become bureaucratic and ossified. In other words, you can fire the people that are really getting in the way. I live in America, and we can't do that. We can't get rid of our president because he's unpopular. We can't get rid of 90-year-old senators with dementia. We just look at these people and ask ourselves, why is it such an amazing, rich, and powerful country is led by people that are so bad, and are so blatantly against the goodwill of our country? It's because the governing system, the operating model, was exclusive, and it was built by a small club for a small club, and it created the fantasy of choice, the fantasy of democracy. If this is my life's work and what will ultimately define whether I did good work or bad work, and we did good work and bad work together, it's going to come down to, did we build a system that can heal itself? And if there are problems, correct those problems. Or did we build a system to perpetuate the systems that we inherited? And if it's the latter, we failed. I think what we have here is a beautiful framework for getting us to an inclusive, diverse, and decentralized ecosystem that still moves quickly with quality and promotes openness for everybody, meaning that you can build onto it and we can move forward. Now, there will be problems, there will be critics. There's plenty of people that are going to say certain parts don't meet their expectations or they want a certain sacred thing to be preserved. And that's the point of debate. And that's why you have to have a consent engine. You have to have a voting layer inside the system because at some point you have to make a decision. And it's not my place to make that decision or Emergo's or the foundations. It's your place to make that decision directly or indirectly through some form of voting system. The point of 1694 and the enormous progress that now more than 1,000 people, more than 50 countries have put a lot of time into to try to get to is to create that voting layer so decisions can be made. And once made, the vehicles of the ecosystem can execute them and execute them well. And if they do a good job, they keep their job. If they don't, somebody else will step in who's better. And we always have the freedom to do that. So I hope this provides a little bit of clarity to everybody. Long video, about almost 50 minutes now, but these are big, meaty, important concepts, and there's a lot of moving pieces to them. And the good news is that there are a ton of amazing people on the Voltaire team, a ton of amazing people throughout the community who've been working really hard to try to get this done. And there's public accountability to it. These big events that are coming up, nearly one a month, each and every one of those events are opportunities for a big chunk of the community. CNFTCon, for example, 3,000 people showed up last time to actually come together and have conversations in person. Nobody hides behind a keyboard. Nobody goes to the ivory tower and barks to people. This is something for everybody in person and throughout the internet and in as many channels as possible to discuss. And once it gets moved over, it goes from we're doing it to it's a suggestion. It has to be ratified. Once it's ratified, we do it as servant leaders. And that's how it should be. I'm really proud of each and every one of you. Just getting a taste of the amazing creativity, passion, and ideas of the community during the SIP 1694 process, what's happened with Cardano DeFi and the NFT space in Cardano, really is a good indication of how powerful we really have become as an ecosystem. It's not if we're going to be number one, it's when, because if we follow this process, we will be. It's unstoppable. There are millions of people now, and those people are all going to be working on this. And the collective knowledge and capability and skill of those millions of people is larger than any Microsoft or Google or Apple or Amazon. And those millions make 10 millions, and those 10 millions make hundreds of millions. And that's how you change the world. Now, it's a long road ahead, and there's a lot to do, but we're not walking that road alone, and we don't rely upon a leader to tell us where to go. We found a way to decide together with one voice and be unified in it. So I hope this gets you excited about Intersect. I sure as hell am, and I'm incredibly excited to work with all of you, and I'm incredibly excited to see the most open, inclusive, diverse, and decentralized development process in the history of the cryptocurrency space come online throughout this year and next year. And I'm incredibly excited to see a consolidated product backlog from working groups that are very diverse in the representation of commercial interests. I really would like to see the DC Sparks and the Bored Apes and all groups of different people come together, some within Cardano, some outside of Cardano. So we have our ape society, there's the Bored Apes over here, all these people in between. There's so many amazing ideas that are floating around. And the point of an aggregation point is you can bring all those amazing ideas into the ecosystem. So if we see something that Polygon is doing, or Solana is doing, or Polkadot is doing, or Algorand is doing, or Ethereum proper is doing, and it's a good idea, there's a place to bring people in and discuss it. There's a place to collaborate. It's no longer competitive. It's no longer tribal. It's no longer this ego versus that ego, or we hate this person, so we can't talk. There's a common place, and we're saying we're trying to solve a problem. How do we bring economic identity to 1 billion people? How do we ensure that this system can be the best place in the world to run DeFi? How do we build something that can become the governance operating system for the nations that don't have it, the financial operating system for the nations that don't have it? How do we preserve and protect the liberty of the users of the system and make sure that they have a say in how their lives work, especially the most vulnerable people? Each and every one of these requires protocols and really cool features and functionality. It requires libraries of software, it requires a lot of new ideas. It's preposterous to assume that we're going to come up with all of it ourselves. We're pretty good, 180 academic papers. That's impressive in such a short period of time, but that pales in comparisons to the totality of all knowledge of the cryptocurrency and the broader computer science ecosystem. So let's build a vehicle that also has the ability to bring all of that in. And let's build something that has the humility to admit an idea is an idea regardless of its origin, and it should be applied towards where we want to go. And let's try to find the best ones and put some checks and balances along the way to prevent people from developing groupthink, cognitive biases, or a power structure that preserves the incumbency at the cost of the many, as we're dealing with right now in the United States for a very long time. So thank you all for listening. A lot of fun to make this video, and I hope it gave you some insight into where we're going. Cheers.